April 1, 1945. Dawn broke over the East China Sea, bathing the massive Allied invasion fleet in pale gold light. Off the southwestern coast of Okinawa, aboard the USS Sandoval, Sergeant Curtis Thompson of the 29th Marine Depot Company stood at the railing, his eyes fixed on the distant shoreline. The mist rising from the water partially obscured the island that lay before them, an island that American military planners had designated as the final stepping stone before the planned invasion of Japan itself. Thompson adjusted his helmet and thought of the leaflets they'd found on Saipan, the ones showing caricatures of black Marines fleeing from Japanese soldiers. "Americans will see who runs today," he murmured to himself. Little did he know that within weeks the same Japanese forces who had mocked his race would witness firsthand the courage and determination of the Black Marines who would help secure one of the most crucial victories of the Pacific War. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how America's segregated Black Marine units, initially relegated to support roles and subjected to racist propaganda from both sides, would ultimately prove themselves in combat on Okinawa, transforming not only the battlefield, but also challenging the very foundations of military segregation that had defined their service. The USS Sandoval rocked gently in the pre-dawn darkness as Sergeant Curtis Thompson made his final equipment check. At 32, Thompson was older than most of the men in his unit, the 29th Marine Depot Company, one of the few all-black units in the Marine Corps. Around him, nearly 100 Black Marines prepared for the landing on Okinawa, checking ammunition, securing equipment, and mentally preparing for what lay ahead. 10 minutes to loading, called out Lieutenant Raymond Jenkins, the white officer in charge of their company. Despite the Marine Corps' strict segregation policies, Jenkins had developed a grudging respect for his men over the past year of deployments. "You heard the lieutenant?" Thompson barked to the men nearby. "Double-check your gear, no mistakes today." Corporal Isaiah Williams, a 23-year-old from Philadelphia, who had become Thompson's right-hand man, nodded grimly. "You think they'll actually let us fight this time, Sarge?" Thompson's expression darkened. Since being activated in 1942, the Montford Point Marines, named for the segregated training facility in North Carolina where all Black Marines were trained, had primarily been assigned to ammunition and supply companies. Despite their training and capabilities, military leadership had been reluctant to deploy them in combat roles. "Our job is ammunition supply," Thompson replied carefully. "But on a beach landing, everyone's a rifleman first." Williams nodded, understanding the subtext. They had trained for combat like every other Marine, but had been consistently denied the opportunity to prove themselves under fire. "Gather round," Thompson called to his squad. 8 men formed a tight circle around him on the crowded deck. "Today's operation is massive. Nearly 200 Thousand troops landing. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions will hit the beaches first, followed by Army units. Our job is to keep those frontline units supplied with ammunition, no matter what." Private First Class Leon Russell, a stocky 18-year-old from Detroit who was on his first combat deployment, raised his hand. "Sarge, is it true what they're saying about the Japanese having leaflets about us?" Thompson hesitated before answering. "Intelligence found propaganda leaflets on Saipan and Iwo Jima. They show caricatures of Black Marines running away from Japanese soldiers. They're trying to use America's own racism against us." "Damn," muttered Corporal David Jackson, a veteran of Saipan. "Fighting for a country that segregates us, against an enemy that mocks us." "That's exactly why we can't fail," Thompson said firmly. "Every ammunition crate we deliver, every supply run we complete under fire, proves them wrong. All of them." The men nodded solemnly as the ship's loudspeaker crackled to life. "All landing teams to your assembly areas. Prepare to board landing craft." As they moved toward their designated area, Thompson caught sight of another Black unit across the deck, members of the 18th Marine Depot Company. He recognized Staff Sergeant James Anderson, a fellow Montford Point graduate, and raised his hand in greeting. Anderson nodded back, his expression a mixture of determination and tension that mirrored Thompson's own feelings. The massive invasion force assembled for Operation Iceberg, the battle for Okinawa, was staggering in its scale. The landing force consisted of 183 Zero troops supported by 300 ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and hundreds of destroyers and landing craft. The 10th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., included the 3 amphibious corps, consisting of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, and the 25th Corps, featuring the Army's 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions. Supporting this massive operation were 23 Black Marine Depot and ammunition companies, totaling approximately 2,000 men. These units had a critical mission, keeping the front lines supplied with ammunition, rations, and equipment under combat conditions. Though officially designated as support units, their proximity to the front lines meant they would often find themselves directly in harm's way. As the landing craft approached the beaches, Thompson was surprised by the relative quiet. Intelligence reports had predicted heavy resistance at the shoreline, but the initial waves were meeting only sporadic fire. Unknown to the landing forces, General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, had made the strategic decision not to contest the landings, but instead to withdraw his 100 Wuzo troops to heavily fortified positions in the southern part of the island. The landing craft ground to a halt on the coral-strewn beach, and the ramp dropped with a metallic clang. "Move out!" Thompson shouted, leading his men onto the beach. They splashed through knee-deep water, each man carrying his personal weapon along with essential equipment. Behind them, landing craft were already bringing in pallets of ammunition and supplies that would become their responsibility. By mid-morning, the 29th Marine Depot Company had established their first ammunition supply point about 300 yards inland from the beach designated as Green 2. Thompson supervised as his men organized crates of ammunition by type: 30 caliber machine gun belts, 60 mm and 81 mm mortar rounds, grenades and rifle ammunition. The sound of distant small arms fire and occasional artillery blasts indicated that despite the relatively unopposed landing, combat was intensifying as Marine units pushed inland. Lieutenant Jenkins approached Thompson, wiping sweat from his brow despite the mild spring temperature. "Thompson, I need you to organize a detail. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines are moving faster than expected and have requested an emergency ammunition resupply." "Yes, sir. How far inland are they?" "About a mile and a half, pushing against light resistance near Yontan Airfield. They've secured a road, but there are reports of Japanese infiltrators, so keep your men alert. This isn't just a supply run. You'll be moving through contested territory." Thompson nodded, concealing his satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of mission that could demonstrate their value beyond mere labor. "We'll get it done, sir. I'll take 2 squads." Within 20 minutes, Thompson had assembled 16 men, loaded 4 jeeps with trailers full of ammunition, and was heading inland. Corporal Williams drove the lead vehicle, with Thompson in the passenger seat scanning the terrain ahead. The landscape was a patchwork of small farming plots, scattered woods, and occasional clusters of stone houses, ideal terrain for ambushes. "Stay alert," Thompson called out to the convoy. "Watch the tree lines and buildings." They had traveled about a mile when Williams suddenly slowed the jeep. "Sarge, checkpoint ahead." A group of Marines from the 5th Regiment had established a roadblock where the narrow road passed between 2 hills. As the convoy approached, Thompson noticed several Marines raising their rifles, their expressions showing surprise at seeing black Marines. "Hold up," called a white sergeant as they approached. "Where are you boys headed?" Thompson felt his jaw tighten at the dismissive tone, but kept his voice professional. "Ammunition resupply for 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. We were told they're near Yontan Airfield." The sergeant looked skeptical. "You're heading into an active combat zone. You sure you're supposed to be up here?" Before Thompson could respond, a young lieutenant emerged from behind the checkpoint. "Are you the ammo we requested? Thank God. We're running low on 80mm mortar rounds, and we've got a Japanese strongpoint holding up the advance." "That's us, sir," Thompson replied, ignoring the sergeant's questioning look. 4 jeeps, full load of mixed ammunition, priority on mortar rounds." "Follow me," the lieutenant said. "We've got to move quickly. The Japanese are bringing up reinforcements." As they passed the checkpoint, Thompson caught the eyes of several white Marines watching them with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. He had experienced similar looks throughout his Marine Corps service, but there was something different now. They were in a combat zone, moving toward the sound of gunfire, and suddenly the color of their skin seemed less important than the ammunition they carried. Half a mile farther, the distant crack of rifle fire grew louder. The lieutenant directed them to pull into a wooded area where a marine company had established a perimeter. As Thompson's men began unloading the precious cargo, a mortar round exploded approximately 200 yards away, followed by several more in quick succession. "Get down!" Thompson shouted as his men instinctively ducked behind the vehicles. The dull crump of mortar fire continued, with rounds landing progressively closer to their position. A harried-looking Marine captain ran over to them. "Get that ammunition distributed now. We've got a Japanese company trying to flank us from that ridge." He pointed to a wooded hill about 400 yards to their east. Thompson's men worked efficiently, passing crates of ammunition to waiting Marines who rushed them to the front lines. The incoming mortar fire intensified, and Thompson heard the distinctive crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles from the direction of the ridge. Suddenly, a mortar round landed just 30 yards from their position, showering them with dirt and fragments. Private Russell was thrown to the ground by the concussion. "Russell!" Thompson rushed to the young Marine's side. Blood was streaming from a shrapnel wound on his arm, but Russell was already struggling to his feet. "I'm okay, Sarge," he insisted, though his face had paled considerably. "Get to the aid station," Thompson ordered, helping him toward a corpsman who was treating casualties behind a stone wall. As Thompson turned back to supervise the unloading, he saw that Williams and Jackson had taken up firing positions alongside white Marines at the perimeter, returning fire at Japanese troops who had appeared at the edge of the woods. "Thompson," Lieutenant Jenkins had arrived with the rest of their company. "We need to move these supplies forward. The battalion CP is taking heavy fire." Without hesitation, Thompson organized his men. "Williams, Jackson, take 6 men and continue distribution here. The rest of you, load up what's left. We're moving forward." The decision to push further into the combat zone went beyond their assigned duties, but Thompson understood the critical nature of the situation. Without ammunition, the Marine advance would stall, potentially leading to higher casualties. Thompson and 8 of his men followed Lieutenant Jenkins through a shallow ravine, carrying crates of ammunition. The sound of battle grew louder, machine gun fire, the sharp cracks of rifle shots, and the periodic thump of grenades. They emerged from the ravine to find a scene of intense combat. Marines were engaged with Japanese forces across a small agricultural field, firing from behind stone walls and irrigation ditches. "The CP is in that farmhouse," Jenkins shouted over the noise, pointing to a sturdy stone building about 100 yards away. Between their position and the command post, the ground was open and exposed to enemy fire. Thompson assessed the situation quickly. "We'll go in teams of 3, maximum speed across the open ground." As the first team prepared to make the run, Japanese machine gun fire swept across the field, kicking up dirt just yards from their position. A Marine lieutenant nearby was struck in the shoulder and fell heavily behind the stone wall they were using for cover. Private Henry Coleman, the company medic, immediately moved to the wounded officer's side, applying pressure to the bleeding wound. "I got you, sir. Just a shoulder wound. You'll be fine." The wounded lieutenant looked up in surprise at being treated by a black corpsman, but nodded gratefully as Coleman efficiently bandaged the injury. "We need covering fire to get across," Thompson told Jenkins. The white officer nodded grimly. "I'll coordinate with that machine gun squad." Minutes later, after Jenkins had spoken with a Marine sergeant commanding an M1919 machine gun team, they were ready to make their move. "On my signal," Jenkins called out, "the machine gunners will provide suppressing fire, then each team crosses while we maintain fire from here." Thompson gathered his first team, himself, Private Walter Morris, and Private George Patterson. "Once we're across, we'll provide covering fire for the next group." When the Marine machine guns opened up with a thunderous barrage aimed at the Japanese positions, Jenkins shouted, "Now!" Thompson and his 2 men sprinted across the open field, each carrying a heavy crate of ammunition. Japanese bullets whined overhead and kicked up dirt around their feet, but the suppressing fire from the Marine positions kept the enemy gunners mostly at bay. They reached the farmhouse and dove through the open doorway, breathing heavily from the exertion and adrenaline. Inside, they found organized chaos. A major was coordinating the defense, radio operators were calling for artillery support, and wounded Marines were being treated by corpsmen in one corner. The major looked up in surprise as 3 black Marines entered with ammunition crates. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Sergeant Thompson, 29th Marine Depot Company, sir. We have the ammunition you requested." The major's expression shifted from confusion to relief. "Thank God, we're down to our last belts for the machine guns. Get those crates opened." Outside, the covering fire intensified as the second team of 3 Marines prepared to make their run. Thompson moved to a window and added his rifle fire to the barrage, providing additional cover for his men. One by one, the remaining teams crossed successfully, though Private First Class Raymond Lewis took a bullet graze to his leg during the final crossing. As the Black Marines distributed ammunition to grateful combat units, Thompson couldn't help but notice the changing attitudes of the White Marines around them. Men who might have used racial slurs back at camp now accepted ammunition with nods of appreciation or even words of thanks. In the crucible of combat, the artificial barriers of segregation were momentarily forgotten in the shared struggle to survive and overcome the enemy. By nightfall, the Marine units had secured their objectives, including the strategically vital Yontan and Kadena airfields. The 29th Marine Depot Company had returned to the beach to prepare for the next day's operations, but word of their actions had spread quickly through the battalion. What had begun as a routine supply mission had evolved into something more significant. Black Marines had not only delivered crucial ammunition under fire, but had engaged the enemy alongside their white counterparts. As Thompson sat with his squad around a small camp stove, Lieutenant Jenkins approached their position. The lieutenant's uniform was dirty and torn, with a small bloodstain on his sleeve from a minor shrapnel wound. "Good work today, Thompson," he said, his tone notably different from the professional but distant manner he typically used. "The battalion commander specifically mentioned your team's performance in his report." Thompson nodded, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected recognition. "We were just doing our job, sir." "No, you went beyond your assigned duties, and every man here knows it," Jenkins replied. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's likely to be even busier." As Jenkins walked away, Corporal Williams leaned closer to Thompson. "Did I hear that right? We actually got a well done from the brass." "Don't get used to it," Thompson replied, though he couldn't completely suppress a small smile. "One day doesn't change what we're up against." Williams looked thoughtfully at the distant flashes of artillery illuminating the night sky. "Maybe not. But it's a start." What neither Thompson nor any of the other Marines yet realized was that the battle for Okinawa was just beginning. The relatively light resistance of the first day had been part of the Japanese strategy. General Ushijima had withdrawn his forces to a series of heavily fortified defensive lines in the southern portion of the island, beginning with the Machinato Line and culminating in the formidable Shuri Line, centered on the ancient Okinawan capital of Shuri Castle. The true test for all Marines on Okinawa, black and white alike, still lay ahead. As the battle for Okinawa intensified over the following days, the role of the Black Marine units evolved rapidly. What had initially been designated as strictly supply and ammunition duties frequently transformed into direct combat support as the fluid battle lines and desperate need for manpower eroded the strict segregation policies that had defined their service. On April 8th, 1 week into the campaign, Sergeant Curtis Thompson stood on a muddy hill overlooking a valley where units of the 1st Marine Division were engaged in a fierce firefight with entrenched Japanese forces. The previous night's heavy rainfall had transformed much of the battlefield into a muddy morass, making the movement of supplies increasingly difficult. "They're pinned down," Lieutenant Jenkins observed, lowering his binoculars. "The 5th Marines have been trying to take that ridge since dawn, but the Japanese have interlocking fields of fire from those bunkers." Thompson nodded grimly. He had seen enough combat over the past week to understand the tactical challenge. The Japanese defensive positions were masterfully constructed, with reinforced bunkers positioned to cover all approaches with machine gun and mortar fire. "Sir, the ammunition request just came through," Corporal Williams reported, approaching them with a written order. They're critically low on mortar rounds and bar ammunition. Battalion says they need it within the hour, or they'll have to withdraw from their current positions. Jenkins studied the valley, where the only approach route was a narrow road exposed to enemy fire for nearly 400 yards. Getting vehicles through there would be suicide, with that Japanese observation post directing fire. Thompson followed the lieutenant's gaze to a small rise where Japanese observers were likely coordinating the deadly accurate mortar fire that had stalled the Marine advance. "We could carry it in, sir. Use that draw to the east for cover, then come up behind the Marine positions." Jenkins looked skeptical. That's at least half a mile on foot, carrying heavy ammunition crates through territory that isn't fully secured. "It's the only way, sir," Thompson insisted. "I'll take 20 volunteers." After a moment's consideration, Jenkins nodded. "Do it. I'll inform Battalion that the ammunition is on its way." Within 15 minutes, Thompson had assembled his team. Alongside his regular squad members were Marines from other Black Depot companies who had volunteered for the dangerous mission. Each man would carry either a crate of mortar rounds or several bandoliers of bar and rifle ammunition, a crushing load over difficult terrain. "This is the situation," Thompson explained, using a stick to draw a rough map in the mud. "We move down this draw, staying low and out of sight. There's approximately 400 yards of exposed terrain at the end where we could take fire from that observation post. Once we reach the Marine lines, we distribute the ammunition and return using the same route. Any questions?" Private First Class Russell, his arm still bandaged from the shrapnel wound he had received on the first day, raised his hand. "Sarge, what happens if we make contact with enemy forces in the draw?" "First team provides covering fire, while second team flanks," Thompson answered. "Standard fire and maneuver, remember your combat training." The men nodded soberly. Despite their official designation as support troops, every Montford Point Marine had completed the same combat training as other Marines, though they had rarely been given the opportunity to use those skills. As they began their difficult journey, each man carrying over 80 pounds of ammunition and equipment, Thompson reflected on the irony of their situation. They had joined a segregated Marine Corps, trained at a segregated facility, and been assigned to segregated units with limited roles. Yet here they were, voluntarily undertaking one of the most dangerous missions of the day, not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood what was at stake if those frontline Marines didn't receive the ammunition they desperately needed. The draw provided good cover initially, its steep banks hiding them from Japanese observation. The men moved in silence, saving their breath for the grueling physical effort of carrying heavy loads through mud that sometimes reached their ankles. Halfway to their objective, they encountered a small stream that had swollen with the previous night's rainfall. "We'll have to cross here," Thompson whispered, studying the fast-moving water that was about waist-deep at its center. "Form a chain, pass the ammunition across first, then follow." The crossing was arduous. The water was numbingly cold, and the current strong enough to threaten their footing on the slippery streambed. Private Coleman lost his balance momentarily, nearly dropping a precious crate of mortar rounds before Corporal Jackson steadied him. "Thanks," Coleman gasped, regaining his grip on the crate. Jackson nodded grimly. "Just imagine explaining to the lieutenant how we lost a crate of 81s because you decided to go swimming." The men chuckled softly at the joke, the brief moment of humor providing a necessary release from the tension. Once across the stream, they continued through the draw, which gradually widened as it approached the valley where the fighting was concentrated. The sound of battle grew louder, the distinctive chatter of Browning automatic rifles, the sharper crack of M1 Garand rifles, and the heavy hammering of 30 caliber machine guns, interspersed with the different-sounding reports of Japanese weapons. As they neared the end of the draw, Thompson held up his fist, signaling the column to halt. Crawling forward to the edge of their cover, he surveyed the battlefield before them. Approximately 400 yards of open ground separated them from the Marine positions, which were visible as a series of hastily dug foxholes and natural depressions along a low ridge. Between their position and the Marines lay a landscape scarred by shell craters and scattered with the debris of combat. More concerning was the Japanese observation post on a hill to their right, about 500 yards away. Through his binoculars, Thompson could see movement. Japanese soldiers adjusting what appeared to be a spotting scope or observation equipment. "What's the plan, Sarge?" Williams asked, crawling up beside him. Thompson considered their options. "We'll use the shell holes for cover, leapfrogging in teams of 2. One team moves while the others provide covering fire if needed." Williams nodded, studying the terrain. "That's going to be slow going with these ammunition crates." "Can't be helped," Thompson replied. "Better slow than dead." He divided the men into 10 teams of 2, each responsible for helping the other reach the next point of cover. "If we start taking fire, don't bunch up. Spread out and keep moving. The Marines on the ridge will provide covering fire once they see what we're doing." With a final check of their equipment, Thompson gave the signal to begin. He and Williams went first, sprinting to the nearest shell crater while carrying their heavy loads. They reached the first crater without incident, breathing heavily from the exertion. Thompson signaled the next team to move, and so it continued, a carefully choreographed movement across the dangerous open ground. They had covered about half the distance when disaster struck. A Japanese spotter in the observation post had finally noticed their movement. Seconds later, mortar rounds began falling near their position, sending geysers of dirt and shrapnel into the air. "Move! Move!" Thompson shouted, abandoning the methodical approach in favor of speed. "Head for the Marine lines!" The Black Marines sprinted across the remaining open ground, still burdened by their heavy loads, but driven by the urgent need to reach safety. Japanese machine gun fire joined the mortar barrage, bullets kicking up dirt around their running feet. From the Marine positions ahead, several machine guns opened up, directing suppressive fire toward the Japanese positions. Marine riflemen stood in their foxholes, firing toward the observation post to provide whatever cover they could for the approaching ammunition carriers. Private Russell was hit first, a bullet striking his already wounded arm. He stumbled but didn't fall, somehow maintaining his grip on the ammunition bandoliers he carried. Private First Class Lewis moved to his side, helping support him as they continued their run toward the Marine lines. Corporal Jackson was less fortunate. A mortar round exploded just yards from his position, the concussion throwing him violently to the ground. The ammunition crate he had been carrying skidded several feet away. "Jackson's down!" shouted Private Coleman, who had been running beside him. Without hesitation, Thompson changed direction, running back toward the fallen Marine. Williams followed close behind, providing covering fire with his rifle as Thompson reached Jackson's side. "I'm okay," Jackson gasped, though blood was seeping from multiple shrapnel wounds on his legs and side. "Get the ammo." Thompson and Williams each grabbed one handle of the heavy crate, while using their free hands to help Jackson to his feet. Together, the 3 Marines staggered toward the Marine lines as mortar rounds continued to fall around them. The final 50 yards seemed endless, but finally they reached the relative safety of the Marine positions. Hands reached out to pull them into a large foxhole, where a white Marine sergeant was directing the defense. "Are you the ammunition we've been waiting for?" the sergeant asked incredulously, taking in the sight of the exhausted Black Marines. 20 men, full load of 81mm rounds, bar ammunition, and rifle bandoliers, Thompson confirmed, still breathing heavily from the exertion. The sergeant's expression transformed from surprise to gratitude. "You just saved our asses. We were down to our last mortar rounds. Get that ammunition distributed immediately." As the Black Marines spread out along the defensive position, handing out the precious supplies to grateful combat troops, Thompson noticed something remarkable. The same Marine Corps that had segregated them, limited their roles, and often treated them with barely disguised contempt, was now accepting them as equals, at least in this moment of shared danger. A white Marine lieutenant approached Thompson as he finished organizing the distribution. "That was one hell of a run, Sergeant. Your men didn't have to take that risk." "We're Marines, sir," Thompson replied simply. "It's what we do." The lieutenant nodded, a new respect evident in his eyes. "We've got wounded that need evacuation, and we're short on stretcher bearers. Could your men help?" "Of course, sir," Thompson agreed without hesitation. "We'll need to get our own wounded out too." For the next several hours, Thompson's men worked alongside the infantry Marines, distributing ammunition, evacuating wounded, and occasionally joining the defensive fire when Japanese infiltrators attempted to approach their positions. By nightfall, the Marine attack had resumed with fresh supplies, eventually securing the contested ridge despite fierce Japanese resistance. As Thompson's team prepared to return to their original position under the cover of darkness, the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, made a point of seeking them out. "I want to thank you men personally," he said, addressing the assembled Black Marines. "Battalion HQ informed me that your mission was voluntary. What you did today saved this company, maybe the entire operation in this sector. I'll be mentioning all of you in my report to regiment." Thompson nodded, accepting the praise on behalf of his men. "Thank you, sir. We were just doing our duty." As they made their way back through the darkness, following a guide from the headquarters company, Corporal Williams walked alongside Thompson. "Did you hear that, Sarge? A lieutenant colonel thanking us. Times are changing." Thompson remained cautious. "One battle doesn't change years of segregation, Williams, but it's something." Williams looked thoughtfully at the star-filled sky, momentarily beautiful despite the distant flashes of artillery that illuminated the horizon. "You know, before we landed, I found a Japanese propaganda leaflet showing Black Marines running away from battle. If only they could see us now." Thompson nodded grimly. "They will, Williams. Before this battle is over, they will." What none of them yet realized was how prophetic those words would prove to be, as the Battle of Okinawa was about to enter its most brutal phase, and the Black Marine units would find themselves increasingly drawn into direct combat roles that would challenge both Japanese propaganda and American prejudice. The battle for Okinawa intensified dramatically as April progressed. After securing the northern two-thirds of the island with relative ease, American forces encountered fanatical resistance when they reached the Japanese main defensive positions in the south. The formidable Shuri Line, a series of mutually supporting defensive positions centered on Shuri Castle, became the scene of some of the Pacific War's most brutal fighting. For the Black Marines of the depot and ammunition companies, the increasing desperation of the battle led to an unexpected development. They were being used more frequently in combat roles, particularly as the casualty rates among frontline units climbed to alarming levels. April 19, 1945. The rain that had fallen steadily for 3 days had finally stopped, but it had left behind a quagmire of mud that transformed the battlefield into a logistical nightmare. Tanks and vehicles became hopelessly mired, forcing most supplies to be moved by hand over terrain that resembled a medieval painting of hell, a landscape of shell craters, shattered trees, and mud so thick it could pull the boots off a man's feet. Sergeant Curtis Thompson stood on a small rise overlooking what had once been the village of Dakeshi, now reduced to scattered stone foundations and rubble. His company had been attached to the 1st Marine Division, which was attempting to break through the outer defenses of the Shuri Line. The casualty rates had been staggering. Some rifle companies were down to less than half their original strength. Lieutenant Jenkins approached, his uniform caked with mud, and his face showing the strain of the past weeks. Like most officers and men on Okinawa, he had aged years in a matter of days. "Thompson, I've just come from a meeting with the regimental staff," Jenkins said without preamble. "The situation has changed. We're being reassigned." Thompson waited expectantly, noting the unusual tension in the lieutenant's voice. "The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, has taken heavy casualties. They're down to 65% strength and still facing determined resistance at Dakeshi Ridge. Division has ordered us to integrate 20 of our men directly into their rifle companies." Thompson couldn't hide his surprise. This represented a significant departure from established policy. "Sir, are you saying we're being assigned as infantrymen?" Jenkins nodded grimly. "Not officially, of course. The paperwork will still list you as depot personnel attached for special duty. But practically speaking, yes, you and 19 others will be joining their rifle platoons, effective immediately." "Who goes, sir?" Thompson asked, already mentally reviewing his men to determine who was best prepared for frontline combat duty. "I'm leaving that to you, Thompson. Select your best men. I've arranged for a crash refresher on infantry tactics with a platoon sergeant from Easy Company. You'll move to their positions at 1600 hours. After Jenkins departed, Thompson called together his non-commissioned officers, Williams, Jackson, now recovered enough for limited duty, and 2 other corporals who had demonstrated leadership under fire. "This is unprecedented," Thompson told them after explaining the new assignment, "but it's also an opportunity to show what we can really do." Corporal Williams nodded thoughtfully. "The men will be ready, Sarge. We've been in enough combat situations these past weeks that it won't be a complete shock. Thompson began listing names of Marines he wanted for the assignment. Williams, Jackson, Russell, Coleman, Patterson. He continued until he had 20 names, men who had shown courage under fire and demonstrated proficiency with their weapons during the campaign. When he assembled the selected men to brief them on their new assignment, the reactions were mixed. Some, like Private First Class Russell, showed clear excitement at the prospect of finally serving in a direct combat role. Others, like Private Henry Coleman, who had been serving primarily as a medic, appeared more apprehensive. "Any questions?" Thompson asked, after outlining what they knew of the assignment. Private Patterson raised his hand. "Sarge, how are the White Marines going to feel about us joining their units? We've all seen how some of them look at us." It was a valid concern that Thompson had been pondering himself. "It won't be easy," he acknowledged. "But remember, these are combat veterans who have been fighting alongside us for weeks now. They're short-handed and facing a determined enemy. At this point, I think most of them care more about whether you can shoot straight and follow orders than about the color of your skin." By late afternoon, Thompson and his 19 men had completed their refresher training and were making their way to the front-line positions of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. They moved in single file through a narrow communications trench, occasionally passing stretcher-bearers evacuating wounded Marines in the opposite direction. A grim reminder of what they were walking into. At the battalion command post, a reinforced cave dug into the reverse slope of a hill, they were met by Major Robert Callahan, the battalion executive officer. Callahan was a lean, weathered Marine in his early 30s who had fought at Guadalcanal and Peleliu before Okinawa. His expression revealed neither approval nor disapproval at the sight of 20 black Marines reporting for infantry duty, merely the pragmatic assessment of a commander receiving badly needed reinforcements. "Sergeant Thompson," he acknowledged, consulting a clipboard. "Your men will be distributed among our 3 rifle companies, 7 each to Item and King companies, and 6 to Love Company. Company commanders will further assign you to platoons based on their needs." Thompson saluted. "Yes, sir. My men are ready." Major Callahan studied him for a moment. "I'll be straight with you, Sergeant. This isn't standard procedure, and not everyone's going to welcome it. But we've lost over 100 men in the past week, and we're facing a Japanese regiment that's dug in like ticks. I don't care if a Marine is black, white, or purple, as long as he does his job and follows orders." "Understood, sir. We won't let you down." "See that you don't. Report to your company commanders immediately. We're resuming the attack at 700 tomorrow." Thompson and Corporal Williams, along with 5 other Marines from their unit, were assigned to King Company, which was holding positions along a ridge overlooking a small valley. The valley itself was dominated by what the Marines had designated Hill 187. A heavily fortified Japanese position that had already repelled 3 separate attacks. Captain Michael Harrison, the King Company commander, met them at his command post behind the front lines. Unlike Major Callahan, Harrison made little effort to hide his skepticism. "So you're my reinforcements," he said, looking over the 7 black Marines with a frown. "Have any of you ever served in a rifle company before?" "No, sir," Thompson replied. "But we've all had infantry training, and we've been under fire numerous times during this campaign while delivering ammunition and supplies." Harrison seemed unimpressed. "There's a difference between being under fire and participating in a coordinated infantry assault against prepared positions. Are your men ready for that?" "We are, sir," Thompson affirmed, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the captain's clear doubt. After a moment's consideration, Harrison nodded curtly. "Very well. Thompson, you and Williams will join the 2nd platoon. They're down to 20 men from the original 40. The rest of your men will go to 1st platoon, which is in even worse shape. Report to Lieutenant Saunders for 2nd platoon, Sergeant Reese for 1st platoon. Dismissed." As they made their way to the 2nd platoon's position, Williams kept his voice low. "He doesn't think we can do it. Then we'll just have to prove him wrong," Thompson replied. "Same as we've been doing since Montford Point." Lieutenant Richard Saunders was younger than Thompson had expected, probably no more than 23 or 24, with the strained expression of a man carrying too much responsibility for his age. He greeted them with curt professionalism at his command post, a shallow cave reinforced with sandbags. "You're my replacements?" he asked, studying the two black Marines. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Curtis Thompson and Corporal Isaiah Williams, reporting as ordered." Saunders nodded, showing neither the skepticism of Captain Harrison nor any particular enthusiasm. "We're at half strength and I've lost 2 squad leaders in the past week. Thompson, I'm assigning you as acting squad leader for the 3rd squad. They're down to 7 men, so with you and Williams you'll have 9. Think you can handle it?" The question seemed designed to test his reaction, and Thompson met it directly. "Yes, sir. I've been leading men since before Montford Point." A flicker of interest crossed the lieutenant's tired face. "Montford Point. You're one of the original Black Marines, then?" "Yes, sir. Enlisted in 42 right after they started accepting us." Saunders studied him with new consideration. "I've heard about the Montford Point Marines. They say your training was even tougher than Paris Island because the instructors wanted to wash you all out." "That's fairly accurate, sir," Thompson acknowledged. After a moment, Saunders nodded, seeming to come to a decision. "We attack Hill 187 at 0700 tomorrow. Your squad will be on our right flank, linking with Item Company. Get settled in, meet your men, check their equipment and ammunition. I'll brief all squad leaders at 2000 hours. The 3rd squad's position was a series of connected foxholes along a rocky outcropping that provided some cover from Japanese artillery." As Thompson and Williams approached, 7 tired, mud-spattered Marines regarded them with expressions ranging from surprise to open hostility. A corporal with a 3-day stubble and a bandage around his left forearm stood up. "I'm Corporal Frank DeMarco. Are you our replacements?" Thompson nodded. "Sergeant Curtis Thompson. I've been assigned as your new squad leader. This is Corporal Williams." DeMarco's eyebrows rose. "No offense, but we were expecting infantry replacements." "That's what we are now," Thompson replied evenly. "Where do you want us to set up?" After a moment of evident internal struggle, DeMarco seemed to accept the situation. "You can take Taylor's spot. He was evacuated this morning. Machine gun round through the shoulder. I'll introduce you to the men." The introductions were brief and somewhat awkward. Besides DeMarco, the squad consisted of PFC Robert Miller, a bar gunner, Privates James Cooper and Thomas Wilson, both riflemen, Private First Class Samuel Grant, the assistant bar gunner, Private Edward Martinez, the squad's designated scout, and Private George Peterson, a replacement who had arrived only 2 days earlier. As night fell, Thompson attended Lieutenant Saunders' briefing, while Williams familiarized himself with their position and got to know the men. The attack plan was straightforward but daunting. After a 15-minute artillery preparation, the battalion would advance across the valley and assault Hill 187 from 3 directions. 2nd Platoon would attack from the right, facing what intelligence identified as several machine gun positions and a network of trenches. When Thompson returned to the squad's position, he gathered the men for his own briefing. "Tomorrow's going to be tough," he began, unfolding a rough map in the dim light of a shielded flashlight. "We're facing at least 2 machine gun nests and connected trenches. Our job is to suppress those positions while 1st Squad moves to flank them from the east." Private Cooper, a lean Texan who had been eyeing the 2 Black Marines suspiciously since their arrival, spoke up. "No offense, Sergeant, but how do we know you can lead this kind of assault? Depot companies don't exactly do a lot of attacking." Thompson met his gaze directly. "I've been a Marine for 3 years, Private. I've been under fire on 3 different islands, and I was leading men when you were still in high school. Any other questions?" Cooper held his gaze for a moment, then looked away without responding. "Get some rest," Thompson concluded. "We move out at 0630 to reach our jump-off positions." As the men settled in for what sleep they could find, Williams moved closer to Thompson in their shared foxhole. "How'd it go with the lieutenant?" "Better than I expected," Thompson admitted quietly. "He seems focused on the mission, not on what we look like. Can't say the same for all the men, though." Williams nodded toward where Cooper was cleaning his rifle. "Some of them will take convincing." "They'll either be convinced or they won't," Thompson replied. "All that matters now is tomorrow. If we do our jobs, stay alive, and help take that hill, the rest will sort itself out." What neither of them could have anticipated was just how severe a test the coming day would bring, not only of their combat skills, but of the fragile beginnings of racial integration in the Marine Corps that their presence represented. Dawn on April 20th arrived with a light mist that clung to the valleys and ridgelines of southern Okinawa, partially obscuring Hill 187 from the Marine positions. At precisely 6:45, the relative quiet was shattered as American artillery batteries opened fire, sending hundreds of shells screaming overhead to impact on the Japanese positions. The hillside erupted in explosions, sending dirt, rock, and fragments of trees skyward. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers added to the bombardment, the distinctive heavier explosions of 5-inch shells creating deeper craters in the Japanese defenses. Sergeant Thompson and his squad crouched in their jump-off position, a shallow depression about 300 yards from the base of Hill 187. Despite the impressive display of firepower, Thompson harbored no illusions about what awaited them. He had seen enough combat on Okinawa to know that Japanese defenders often emerged from seemingly destroyed positions to continue fighting with undiminished ferocity. "Remember short rushes, good use of cover," he reminded his men as the artillery barrage reached its climax. "Miller, keep that bar talking. Wilson and Cooper, watch our left flank for infiltrators. Williams will be with me on point." At 0700 precisely, the artillery lifted, shifting to targets further behind the hill to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the battle. Lieutenant Saunders' whistle shrilled above the diminishing echoes of the bombardment, and 2nd Platoon began their advance across the valley toward Hill 187. For the first 100 yards, they encountered no resistance. Then, as if on cue, Japanese machine guns opened fire from concealed positions that had survived the bombardment. To their right, Marines from Item Company began taking casualties, several men falling as they crossed an exposed stretch of ground. "Down!" Thompson shouted, as bullets kicked up dirt just yards ahead of their position. His squad dropped to the ground, using whatever depressions or rocks they could find for cover. Through his binoculars, Thompson located one of the Japanese machine gun positions, a small bunker skillfully camouflaged with local vegetation about halfway up the hill. "Miller, bunker at 2 o'clock about 200 yards up the slope. Can you hit it?" PFC Miller, the bar gunner, sighted along his weapon. "I'll try, Sarge." The Browning automatic rifle chattered in short, controlled bursts, sending 30-06 rounds toward the Japanese position. Thompson couldn't tell if they were hitting the bunker or not, but the Japanese fire seemed to shift away from their position, focusing instead on Marines from 1st Squad who were trying to advance on their left. "Williams, take Cooper and Martinez. Work your way right using that drainage ditch. See if you can get an angle on that bunker. We'll provide covering fire." Corporal Williams nodded, tapping Cooper and Martinez on the shoulders and pointing toward the shallow ditch that ran at an angle across their front. The 3 Marines belly-crawled to the ditch, then began moving laterally, using its minimal cover to mask their movement. Thompson directed the rest of the squad to provide suppressive fire, with Miller's bar focusing on the known bunker, while the riflemen scanned for and engaged any Japanese soldiers who exposed themselves. Across the battlefield, the entire battalion was facing determined resistance. To their left, Thompson could see Marines from 3rd Platoon pinned down by interlocking fire from multiple positions. Lieutenant Saunders was moving between his squads, coordinating their efforts while staying remarkably exposed to enemy fire. A runner reached Thompson's position, sliding into cover beside him. "Lieutenant says to hold position," he gasped. "Battalion is bringing up flamethrower teams to deal with the bunkers. Should be here in 5 minutes." Thompson acknowledged the order, then turned to check on Williams' flanking movement. He was disturbed to see that they had stopped advancing and appeared to be taking cover behind a large rock. Through his binoculars, he could make out Martinez lying motionless beside the rock, apparently hit. Before he could decide on a course of action, the Japanese launched a counterattack. Approximately 20 soldiers emerged from concealed positions on the reverse slope, charging down toward the pinned-down Marines with fixed bayonets, screaming, "Banzai!" The suddenness of the attack caught several Marine squads by surprise. "Targets front!" Thompson shouted as the Japanese soldiers appeared in their sector. Miller immediately shifted his bar to engage the charging enemy, while the riflemen opened fire with their M1s. 2 Japanese soldiers fell immediately under the accurate fire, but the others continued their charge, seemingly oblivious to casualties. On their left, 1st Squad was in serious trouble. The Japanese attack had caught them in the open, and Thompson could see at least 3 Marines down. The squad leader was frantically trying to organize a defense, but they were dangerously close to being overrun. "DeMarco, hold this position," Thompson ordered. "Keep firing on that bunker. Grant, Peterson, with me." Without waiting for acknowledgement, Thompson began moving laterally toward the embattled 1st Squad, using available cover while maintaining fire with his M1 Garand. Grant and Peterson followed, though he noted Peterson's obvious fear as the young replacement moved with trembling hands. They reached 1st Squad's position just as the Japanese attackers closed to within 20 yards. The squad leader was down, clutching a wound in his side, while the remaining Marines fired desperately at the charging enemy. "Left to right, controlled fire," Thompson shouted, bringing his own rifle up. He sighted on the foremost Japanese soldier and squeezed the trigger, feeling the Garand's familiar recoil against his shoulder. The enemy soldier stumbled and fell, but others continued forward. Peterson, despite his earlier fear, proved to be an excellent shot. From a kneeling position, he fired his M1 methodically, each shot finding its target. Grant added his rifle fire to the defense, and gradually the Japanese attack lost momentum as their numbers dwindled. The final 3 attackers reached the Marine position, resulting in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Thompson found himself facing a Japanese officer who lunged at him with a sword. He parried the strike with his rifle, then smashed the butt into the officer's face with enough force to send him sprawling backward. Before the Japanese officer could recover, Peterson fired a single shot that ended the threat. The brief, violent counterattack had been repulsed, but at significant cost. 1st Squad had lost 4 men, including their squad leader. Thompson quickly organized the survivors, placing Grant in charge of their position while he assessed the overall situation. On their right, he could see that Williams, Cooper and Martinez were still in trouble. Martinez hadn't moved, and the other 2 appeared to be pinned down by fire from a second Japanese position that hadn't been visible earlier. Thompson was about to attempt another flanking movement to help them when the promised flamethrower teams finally arrived. 2 teams from the 1st Marines Weapons Company moved up, each consisting of a flamethrower operator and 2 riflemen for protection. Lieutenant Saunders directed one team toward the bunker that had pinned down Williams and Cooper. The Marines advanced in short rushes, the riflemen providing covering fire, while the flamethrower operator closed to effective range. When he was approximately 40 yards from the Japanese position, the operator triggered his weapon. A stream of jellied gasoline erupted from the nozzle, arcing through the air to splash against the bunker's firing port. The effect was immediate and devastating. Flames engulfed the position, and moments later, 2 burning Japanese soldiers emerged, only to be cut down by Marine rifle fire. With the elimination of the bunker, Williams and Cooper were able to move again. They retrieved Martinez, who had been wounded in the leg but was still alive, and began making their way back to the squad's position. The battle continued for another 2 hours as Marine units worked methodically to clear the hill of Japanese defenders. By mid-morning, Hill 187 was secured, though at a heavy cost. King Company alone had suffered 23 casualties, including 7 killed. Thompson's squad had been relatively fortunate, with Martinez's leg wound being their only casualty. As they consolidated their positions on the newly captured hill, preparing for the inevitable Japanese counterattack, Captain Harrison made a point of visiting each squad. When he reached Thompson's position, his earlier skepticism seemed to have been replaced by grudging respect. "Your squad performed well, Sergeant," he acknowledged. "Lieutenant Saunders mentioned your quick action in supporting 1st Squad during the counterattack." "Thank you, sir," Thompson replied, somewhat surprised by the commendation. "The men did their job." Harrison nodded, then added more quietly, "I'll be honest, Thompson, I had my doubts about putting Depot Marines in a rifle company. Consider those doubts resolved." As the captain moved on to the next position, Corporal Williams approached. "Looks like we changed at least 1 mind today." Thompson allowed himself a small smile. "One battle at a time, Williams, 1 battle at a time." What neither of them realized was that their actions that day would soon have repercussions far beyond Hill 187. As news of Black Marines successfully integrated into combat units spread through the division, other units facing similar manpower shortages began to request similar arrangements. What had begun as an emergency measure was becoming, by necessity if not by policy, a significant crack in the wall of segregation that had defined the Marine Corps since its inception. And in the larger context of the battle for Okinawa, they had helped secure just one small hill in what would prove to be an 82-day campaign of unrelenting brutality. A campaign that would ultimately claim more than 14 one-world American lives, including over 3 one-world Marines. For the Black Marines who had once been relegated to support roles, the bitter irony was that their opportunity to prove themselves as combat troops had come at such a terrible cost. As May began, the Battle of Okinawa entered its most brutal phase. The Japanese defenders, having delayed the American advance for weeks with their determined defense of the Makinato Line, now withdrew to their final defensive position, the formidable Shuri Line centered on ancient Shuri Castle. Here, General Ushijima had concentrated his remaining forces in an intricate network of caves, bunkers, and fortified ridgelines. For Sergeant Thompson and the other Black Marines who had been integrated into combat units, the past 2 weeks had brought a strange new reality. They were no longer viewed as an experiment or an emergency measure. They had become, by necessity, and through their own proven abilities, accepted members of their rifle companies. The constant pressure of combat, the shared dangers and hardships, had eroded many of the racial barriers that had once seemed impenetrable. May 10, 1945. The early morning sky over Okinawa was clear, offering no hint of the approaching meteorological disaster that would soon transform the battlefield. Sergeant Thompson sat with Lieutenant Saunders and the other squad leaders in a damaged Okinawan farmhouse that served as 2nd Platoon's command post. Rain had fallen intermittently over the previous days, but nothing had prepared them for the forecast they were now receiving. Division Meteorological Section is predicting a major storm system, Saunders explained, pointing to a weather map. Heavy rainfall beginning this afternoon and continuing for at least 72 hours. We're talking about potentially 10 inches or more. Corporal DeMarco, who had eventually formed a respectful working relationship with Thompson, whistled softly. The whole island's going to turn to mud. Exactly, Saunders confirmed grimly. And that means we need to prepare our positions now. The Japanese know this terrain better than we do. They'll use the weather to infiltrate our lines if we're not careful. The lieutenant turned to Thompson. Your squad will maintain position on the right flank. I want improved drainage around all foxholes, extra ammunition stockpiled and kept dry, and continuous observation despite the weather. The Japanese will be suffering in this rain too, but they've had months to prepare their positions. We haven't. Thompson nodded, mentally cataloguing the preparations needed. What about resupply, sir? If the roads turn to mud, we could be isolated for days. Battalion is pushing forward as many supplies as possible before the storm hits. After that, we'll be on our own until the weather clears. As the meeting concluded, Thompson found Saunders holding him back as the other squad leaders departed. Thompson, there's something else you should know. I received word from company this morning. Your original depot company is being rotated to the rear for restructuring. Thompson frowned. What about us, sir? Those of us who were transferred to rifle companies. That's just it, Saunders replied. The orders don't mention you. As far as I can tell, you and the other depot Marines who've been serving as infantrymen are staying right where you are. It seems the brass has decided that changing things mid-battle isn't worth the disruption. Thompson absorbed this information with mixed emotions. On one hand, it meant continued danger on the front lines. On the other, it represented an unprecedented recognition of their value as combat Marines. Understood, sir. I'll inform Williams and check on the others who were distributed to different companies. By early afternoon, the predicted storm had arrived with a vengeance. The rain began as a steady downpour, but quickly intensified into a deluge that reduced visibility to mere yards and transformed the battlefield into a quagmire. Thompson's squad had spent the morning improving their positions, digging drainage channels around foxholes, constructing crude shelters from ponchos and salvage materials, and waterproofing their ammunition as best they could. Now, as they huddled in their waterlogged positions, the discomfort was universal and colorblind. Black and white Marines alike suffered in the relentless rain, sharing what little dry space and supplies they had. Thompson moved between positions, checking on his men and ensuring their vigilance despite the miserable conditions. "Anything moving out there?" he asked Private Wilson, who was on observation duty peering through the rain toward the Japanese lines. Wilson shook his head, water cascading from his helmet. "Nothing I can see, Sarge. Visibility's down to maybe 30 yards. They'd have to be crazy to move in this." "That's exactly when they might try," Thompson cautioned. "Stay alert. Relief in 30 minutes. As he continued his rounds, Thompson came across Private Cooper huddled miserably in a foxhole that was rapidly filling with water, despite their earlier drainage efforts. Cooper had been one of the most openly hostile to the Black Marines initially, but weeks of shared combat had mellowed his attitude considerably. "How are you holding up, Cooper?" Thompson asked, crouching beside the foxhole. Cooper grimaced, trying unsuccessfully to find a position where he wasn't sitting in water. "Been better, Sarge. Thinking fondly of Texas heat right about now." Thompson nodded sympathetically. "Dig that drainage channel deeper when you get a chance, and here," he added, passing over a precious dry pair of socks from his own pack. "Change those when you can. Trench foot will take you out of the fight faster than a bullet." Cooper seemed momentarily surprised by the gesture, then nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Sarge. I'll pass some dry socks forward when supply brings them up." "If supply makes it through this mess," Thompson replied, glancing back toward their tenuous supply lines, now likely impassable to vehicles. By nightfall, the situation had deteriorated further. The rain continued unabated, turning hillsides into mudslides and flooding low-lying areas. More concerning was the effect on communications. Field telephone lines were failing as water seeped into connections, and radio batteries were being rapidly depleted by constant use. Lieutenant Saunders called his squad leaders together in the relative shelter of a large rock overhang. "We've lost direct communication with battalion," he informed them, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Runner reports that they're having the same problems across the entire front. We're effectively on our own until the weather improves." "What about the Japanese?" asked Sergeant Reynolds, who had taken over First Squad after their previous leader was evacuated. "No significant movement reported. But visibility is so poor they could be massing for an attack, and we wouldn't know until they were on top of us. That's why we're doubling watches tonight. No one sleeps more than 2 hours at a stretch." Thompson nodded grimly. The exhaustion of constant vigilance in such conditions would take a serious toll on the men's effectiveness, but the alternative, being surprised by a Japanese attack, was unacceptable. As he turned to leave, Saunders added, "Thompson, your squad's position is closest to Item Company. We've lost contact with them completely. I need you to send a 2-man patrol to re-establish communications and ensure there isn't a gap in our lines." "Yes, sir. I'll handle it personally." Thompson found Corporal Williams attempting to clean his rifle under the minimal shelter of a poncho stretched between rocks. "We need to check on Item Company. Communications are down, and the lieutenant is concerned about a gap in the lines." Williams carefully reassembled his weapon. "Just the 2 of us? The fewer the better in these conditions. Less chance of friendly fire incidents." Thompson checked his own rifle and made sure his grenades were secure. "We'll follow the ridgeline, should be about 300 yards to their nearest position." Moving through the storm-lashed darkness proved even more challenging than anticipated. The mud was ankle-deep in places, making each step an exhausting effort. Visibility was reduced to a few yards even with their night-adapted vision, and the constant roar of the rain masked any other sounds, including potential enemy movement. They had covered perhaps 200 yards, moving cautiously along the ridge, when Williams suddenly grabbed Thompson's arm, pulling him down. "Movement ahead," he whispered directly into Thompson's ear to be heard over the rain. Thompson strained to see through the darkness and driving rain. After a moment, he made out several dark figures moving perpendicular to their position, heading down the slope toward the American lines. Their hunched movements and the distinctive silhouette of Japanese helmets identified them immediately as enemy soldiers. "Infiltration team," Thompson whispered back. "Looks like about 8 of them." They watched as the Japanese patrol continued their cautious advance, clearly using the storm as cover for a reconnaissance mission, or possibly to attack vulnerable positions. Thompson faced a quick decision. They could either engage the patrol immediately or allow them to pass and continue to Item Company to warn of the infiltration. We can't let them get behind our lines, he decided. 2 of us against 8, not great odds, but we have surprise. Williams nodded grimly, readying his rifle. The M1 Garand was a superb battle rifle, but in these conditions there was a real risk of malfunction if water had seeped into the action despite their precautions. I'll take the first 4, you take the last 4, Thompson instructed, on my signal. They waited until the Japanese patrol was directly below their position on the ridge. Thompson raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, and finally clenched his fist, the signal to fire. Both M1 Garands barked simultaneously, the muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the scene. 2 Japanese soldiers fell immediately. Thompson worked the action of his rifle and fired again, downing a 3rd enemy soldier as the remaining Japanese scattered, searching for the source of the attack. Several returned fire, their Arisaka rifles cracking in the darkness. Bullets snapped overhead or thudded into the mud nearby, but in the darkness and rain, the Japanese were firing blind. Williams managed to hit a 4th enemy soldier, but then his rifle jammed, likely due to mud or water contamination. Without hesitation, he drew his .45 caliber pistol and continued firing at the remaining Japanese who were now attempting to withdraw. Thompson's rifle still functioned, and he accounted for a 5th enemy soldier before the survivors disappeared into the stormy darkness. The entire engagement had lasted less than a minute. "You okay?" Thompson asked, checking Williams for injuries. "Fine. Rifle's jammed, but I'm not hit." Williams was already attempting to clear the malfunction, working the operating rod to extract the stuck cartridge. "We need to alert the line," Thompson decided. "Those 3 survivors will likely return with reinforcements." They continued toward Item Company's position with increased urgency, finally reaching their lines after another 10 minutes of difficult travel. They were challenged by a nervous sentry and had to identify themselves carefully to avoid being fired upon as infiltrators. The Item Company position was in similar condition to their own, Marines huddled in flooded foxholes, struggling to maintain vigilance despite the miserable conditions. They were directed to the company command post, where Captain Lewis, the company commander, was studying a map by the light of a shielded flashlight. "Sergeant Thompson, King Company 2nd Platoon," Thompson reported. "Lieutenant Saunders sent us to re-establish communications and check for gaps in the line." Captain Lewis looked up with evident relief. "Glad to see you. We've been completely out of contact for the past 4 hours. Had no idea if you boys were still holding your positions or if the Japanese had broken through." Thompson quickly informed the captain about the infiltration team they had encountered and the likelihood of further attempts. Lewis immediately ordered increased vigilance and sent runners to alert his platoons. "You 2 had better stay here until daylight," Lewis suggested. "Too dangerous to move back in these conditions, especially with confirmed enemy activity between our positions." Thompson agreed, and they spent the remainder of the night helping Item Company prepare for possible Japanese attacks. True to their prediction, the Japanese launched several small-scale infiltration attempts before dawn, but the forewarned Marines repulsed each one. When the grey light of dawn finally penetrated the continuing downpour, Thompson and Williams prepared to return to their own unit. Captain Lewis approached them before they departed, offering a rare commodity, hot coffee from a small stove they had managed to keep functioning despite the rain. "That was good work last night, intercepting that patrol," Lewis said, as they gratefully accepted the steaming cups. "Probably saved lives on both our lines." "Just doing our job, sir," Thompson replied, savoring the warmth of the coffee after the long, cold night. Lewis studied them thoughtfully. "You know, when they first started integrating black Marines into combat units, I had my doubts. Not about your courage, mind you, but about how the men would react, whether it would affect unit cohesion." Thompson remained silent, waiting for the captain to continue. "I was wrong," Lewis acknowledged simply. "What I've seen over the past weeks, black and white Marines fighting side by side depending on each other, it's changed my thinking. Changed a lot of minds, I'd wager." "The Japanese don't care what color we are when they're shooting at us, sir," Williams observed. "Kind of puts things in perspective." Lewis nodded. "Indeed it does, Corporal. Indeed it does." As Thompson and Williams made their way back to their own lines, slogging through the seemingly endless mud and rain, Thompson reflected on the captain's words. The changes happening here on Okinawa, Black Marines serving in combat roles alongside their white counterparts, being judged by their actions rather than their skin color, represented a profound shift, even if it had come about through necessity rather than design. What none of them yet realized was that these experiences on Okinawa would eventually contribute to a larger transformation. 3 years later, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman would issue Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces of the United States. The demonstrated valor and effectiveness of Black Marines on Okinawa would become part of the evidence that segregation not only violated American ideals, but also undermined military effectiveness. But on that rain-soaked May morning in 1945, such far-reaching consequences remained invisible to the men fighting for survival in the mud of Okinawa. For Sergeant Curtis Thompson and his fellow Marines, both black and white, the immediate concerns were much more pressing: staying alive, keeping their weapons functioning, and continuing the slow, costly advance against a determined enemy who had sworn to fight to the last man. The torrential rains that had turned Okinawa into a quagmire continued for nearly a week, effectively halting major operations on both sides. When the skies finally cleared on May 17th, the Marines found themselves facing a transformed battlefield. Streams had become raging torrents, roads had disappeared under mudslides, and the elaborate trench systems that had characterized the front lines were now often half filled with water and collapsing mud. For the American forces, the logistical challenges were immense. Tanks and vehicles had been immobilized by the mud, supply lines disrupted, and many units left isolated during the storms. But for the Japanese defenders, the situation was even more dire. Their carefully prepared defensive positions had suffered significant damage, and their already strained supply situation had deteriorated further. As the Marine divisions resumed their offensive operations against the Shuri Line, the 1st Marine Division, including Thompson's unit, was assigned to attack a key strongpoint known to the Americans as Sugar Loaf Hill, a relatively small rise that had taken on enormous tactical importance due to its position. The hill provided the Japanese with excellent observation over a wide area and anchored the western flank of their main defensive line. May 18, 1945. Sergeant Curtis Thompson stood with Lieutenant Saunders and the other squad leaders on an observation point, approximately 800 yards from Sugar Loaf Hill. Through his binoculars, Thompson studied the seemingly innocuous rise in the landscape that had already claimed hundreds of Marine lives in repeated failed assaults. "Sugarloaf doesn't look like much," observed Corporal DeMarco, "but Division says it's the key to breaking the Shuri Line." Lieutenant Saunders nodded grimly. "The 6th Marine Division has already made 6 separate attacks on it in the past 4 days. They've taken it 3 times, but couldn't hold it against counterattacks. Now it's our turn." The lieutenant spread a map on a flat rock, weighing the corners with stones to prevent the persistent breeze from carrying it away. "The entire 1st Marine Division is being committed to this sector. Our battalion will attack Sugarloaf directly, while the 5th Marines hit the connecting ridges to isolate it from Japanese reinforcement." Thompson studied the map carefully. Sugarloaf was actually part of a complex of 3 interconnected hills that the Japanese had fortified extensively. Previous attacks had demonstrated that taking one hill was useless if the others remained in enemy hands, as interlocking fields of fire made holding any single position impossible. "What about tanks, sir?" asked Sergeant Reynolds. "The ground looks pretty firm now that it's had a day to dry." "Limited tank support only," Saunders replied. "The approaches are still too soft in places, and there are minefields we haven't fully cleared. We'll have artillery and naval gunfire support, plus airstrikes before we jump off. But this is primarily going to be an infantry operation." The attack plan was methodical and reflected the hard-won lessons of previous failed assaults. Rather than a frontal attack, the Marines would approach from multiple directions simultaneously, supported by flamethrower teams and demolition squads to reduce the Japanese bunkers and cave positions. Thompson's squad was assigned to the right flank of the company's attack, with the mission of securing a small rise that would provide covering fire for the main assault on Sugarloaf itself. It was a critical position, as failure to secure this ground would leave the main attack vulnerable to enfilading fire. As they returned to their assembly areas to prepare for the attack scheduled for the following morning, Corporal Williams walked alongside Thompson. "Sugarloaf." "Huh? The replacements are saying it's a meat grinder." Thompson nodded soberly. "They're not wrong. The 6th took almost 1,000 casualties trying to take it. And now it's our turn," Williams observed quietly. "At least we're not being held back because of our color anymore. For better or worse, we're in it just like everyone else." Throughout the remainder of the day, Thompson's squad prepared methodically for the coming battle. Weapons were cleaned and checked multiple times, ammunition distributed, rations consumed, and what little rest could be found was taken in shifts. Thompson spent time with each man individually, reviewing their specific roles in the coming attack and addressing any concerns. Private Patterson, who had developed into a reliable scout during their weeks on the line, studied the aerial photographs of their objective with particular attention. "The Japanese will have those drawers covered with machine guns," he observed, pointing to several narrow defiles that approached their objective. The battle for Sugarloaf Hill proved to be as brutal as anticipated. Over 3 days of savage fighting, Thompson's squad helped secure their objective, suffering casualties but maintaining their position despite repeated Japanese counterattacks. When Sugarloaf finally fell, it marked the beginning of the end for organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. By June 18, 1945, the island was declared secure, though pockets of Japanese resistance would continue fighting for weeks. During the formal flag-raising ceremony at 10th Army Headquarters, Sergeant Thompson stood at attention with a mixed company of black and white Marines. The unit segregation that had once seemed immutable had been permanently altered by the crucible of combat. 2 days later, Thompson received orders that he and his fellow black Marines would be returning to their original depot companies, but with a significant difference. They would retain their combat designations and responsibilities. The emergency integration necessitated by battle had proven too successful to reverse completely. General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3 Amphibious Corps, made a point of personally acknowledging the contributions of the Black Marine units. "The performance of these Marines under fire has been exemplary," he noted in his official report. "Their courage and dedication have been in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps." In August 1945, following the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. As occupation duties replaced combat operations, the Black Marines found themselves in an unprecedented position, respected veterans whose service could no longer be diminished or ignored. Sergeant Thompson, standing on the deck of a transport ship heading back to the United States in November 1945, reflected on the journey that had brought him and his fellow Montford Point Marines from segregated training to integrated combat units. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Williams said, joining him at the railing. "Those Japanese propaganda leaflets showing Black Marines running from battle." Thompson nodded. "Ironic, isn't it? They tried to use America's own racism against us, and instead they helped change it." "Not completely changed," Williams cautioned. "We're going home to the same America we left." "Not exactly the same," Thompson replied. "We're not the same, and neither are the white Marines who fought beside us. That counts for something." 3 years later, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman would issue Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces. The experiences of Black Marines on Okinawa had helped demonstrate that segregation undermined military effectiveness and contradicted the very principles for which they had fought. For Curtis Thompson and the other Black Marines who had endured discrimination only to prove themselves in the war's bloodiest battles, the recognition was long overdue but deeply meaningful. Their story, from being mocked in Japanese propaganda to helping secure victory on Okinawa, would become part of the larger narrative of how America began the long process of confronting its contradictions and moving, however imperfectly, toward its professed ideals. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.